Hopefully you can all hear me. I won't ask for responses all round, but what I will do is I'm just going to mute everybody's for everybody's comfort while I'm talking. I'll run through the presentation as I mentioned in the invite. It's about half an hour with some PowerPoint and me chatting away. I'll ask that I take questions at the end rather than during the presentation, but I've got as long as you like after the presentation that we can sit and take questions as well. So that's not a problem. So I'm going to dive straight on in. And basically what we're talking about today is you've been asked to produce some S1000D. You don't really know S1000D as a specification. You don't know what that might entail. And so this presentation is really, it's not about giving you some answers. It's about giving you the questions to ask and the things that you need to understand if you're going to be producing S1000D. So just a little bit about me. Some of you know me already. I've met some of you guys at the user forums. I've done some online training with some of you and various different things. My name is Steve. I spent about 20 years in the Royal Air Force as a pilot. I've been involved with S1000D since about the year 2000, which is quite scary now because it's over 20 years. So actually I've been involved with S1000D longer than I was in the Air Force. For some of that time when I was kind of first actively involved, because my background was aircrew, I was the chair of the Air Pubs working group at a time that we were introducing that to the specification. That's obviously long ago well established now, and it's kind of a core part that, as well as providing maintainer information, that we provide the operator information as well. Left the Air Force in 2009, and since then I've been contracting in the world of tech pubs. So it's kind of my bread and butter these days. Lots of people say, why didn't I go and fly civilian airlines when I left? To be honest, after the flying that I did to flog backwards and forwards with a bunch of drunken tourists to Malaga, watching an autopilot fly an aeroplane wasn't really my idea of fun. I wanted something that would challenge my brain, and tech pubs is a challenge. So I joined Mecon January last year as the customer support manager, but actually I've known Mecon since my Air Force days. I met them because they used to do our software for us back then for producing the aircrew pubs. So it was kind of almost like coming home in a sense. When I joined Mecon, I knew a lot of the faces that are still around in the company. I'm now the primary technical lead for all the S1000D programs. We have some very good developers that have also been in S1000D for a long time, and our various different applications have been on the market for a long while. Just a little quick picture for you. I don't know how many of you will recognize that. That is known as a Nimrod. Nimrod being named after the biblical mighty hunter, as opposed to the deep South American dork. I prefer the mighty hunter version. But that's what I flew in my Air Force days. Just to give you a bit of context. Unfortunately, they are now all long gone and are being replaced gradually with the American P8. So let's have a little quick outline. I'm just going to throw my picture down in the bottom corner here for you, and I'll try not to get in the way of the slides. But hopefully you can make the slide deck full screen and follow along with me. So outline for what we're going to look at today. I put training first and foremost. I'll explain why I think that is the most important thing. And it's not just about how do I write S1000D, but there's an awful lot more to it than that. We'll look at some of the tools. S1000D talks about CSDBs, and then there's authoring tools and other checking tools and so on. We'll look at some of the thoughts behind actually setting up a project. A lot of that will change depending whether this is something you're doing for yourself or whether you're doing it for somebody else as a subcontractor and so on. And we'll also look at converting existing data, because if you're already contracting in the aerospace world and it's just the fact that you're now providing some information S1000D, you've probably already got a lot of your own data. And then finally, we'll have a bit of a talk about deliverables and actually understanding what you've been asked to produce, because you could end up doing an awful lot more work than you need to if you get that bit wrong.
Can you fly that thing?
Not yet.
Operator.
Tank, I need a pilot program for a B-212 helicopter. Hurry. Let's go.
Wouldn't it be great if we could just plug in and download S1000D, a bit like Neo in the Matrix? Quick upload from Tank, and I know S1000D, but yeah, it doesn't quite work that way. So training, I said I think it's the most important. You need to know what you're talking about, because if you don't know what you're talking about, whether that's from an authoring perspective of actually creating content, or from a business perspective in how you're contracting, the tools that people are offering you, the processes people are telling you that you need. If you don't understand what you're talking about, you could end up spending or wasting an awful lot more money than you need to. So what am I considering? Terminology. S1000D is a world full of acronyms, and people will talk to you about their BRECs and their SNS and their DMs and their DMRLs and so on. As I say, this isn't a tutorial. If you want a tutorial on what all those things actually are, then there are lots of people out there on the web that offer them. We as Mecon offer S1000D tutorials at both management level and authoring level, but that's not my aim today. But you need to get into what some of these terms mean, and depending which part of the business you're in, whether you're in management, whether you are a TechPubs team leader, whether you are the accountant, or whether you're the author at the coalface, there will be certain terms here that become bread and butter if you're working in S1000D. Codification, and for some reason that's kind of gone right to the edges of my screen, but you can see what we need to see there. So what I've basically given you there is an S1000D file name, and I'll just take me out the corner so you can see it properly. Codification is the bread and butter of S1000D. S1000D breaks everything down into hundreds, if not thousands, of data modules, and every one of them will have a unique code. And then, of course, you also get into version control because things change, things get up issued, and so we then have to have a way of distinguishing the same data module but at a different revision. So that's done by codification. And I'm not, again, going to try and teach you how the whole of the system works right now, but there are logical chunks. So the bit I've highlighted there, Mecon Pubs, identifies that this is one of my publications at Mecon. And the N02 tells me what the specific project variant is. In this case, N02 actually stands for our CSDB, and so this is one of the publications about our CSDB. If I move on to the next bit, the U30 300000A, lots of zeros there, and there's a good reason for that. This part in the middle here is known as the SNS, the standard numbering system. If any of you guys have worked in ATA 100 or ATA iSpec 2200 in the past, then this is actually the same codification system as used in iSpec. But S1000D have taken it, they've provided various options that you can use, managed ones that have already been designed for you. If you are doing a completely different type of project, you can design your own. And that again is what I've done here for my publication. So the U tells me it's a user manual, and then the 303000 tells me which chapter, section and subsection that I'm looking at. The 00 tells me which part of information that I need. The final 00A is known as the disassembly code in S1000D, and that would give me a breakdown if I was working on, for example, a component. So the 303000 would tell me what the top level or what the main component was, and then the 00A at the end would give me the breakdown of the things that go inside it. Well, because I'm documenting software here, there isn't really a breakdown, so we don't particularly use that last section. Moving on down, we have what's known as the information and location codes, and what the information code tells me is what I'm writing about. Now, if I was documenting something like an aircraft or a component on a ship or some kind of armored vehicle, then while the SNS gives me the details about the thing that I'm documenting, the information code tells me what I'm writing about it. In this case, 040 just means that I'm writing descriptive information. However, if this was a component that needed some kind of maintenance, it might have a remove procedure, it might have an install procedure, it might have various test, clean, repair procedures, and the information code tells us what they are. And again, there's a whole list of these within S1000D that are maintained for us. So we just go and pick the right information code for the type of content. So from that breakdown straight away, we've got the thing that we're writing about, we've got the component within the thing that we're writing about, and we've got the type of information we're providing. And then the last couple of letters here tell us whether we're using variations on the information, where the thing is when we're doing work on it. Is it actually installed? Is it on a bench in a service bay, and so on. The last piece in the file name, and this isn't really part of the data module code properly as such, but it's presented in the file name for so that we can understand more about the file we're looking at, is the issue and in work number. So 001 means that I'm at issue 1. 00 is the in work number, means that this one is issued. Anytime that this is still in draft, that in work number will be greater than 0. Once I've actually issued it and it's all been signed off, and I'll talk more about governance as we go along, then that issue number becomes number 1. And then the last little bit is my language information. So I can have multiple languages about the same piece of information if I'm doing translations for different nationalities. In this case, obviously, it's English and GB, so Great Britain. So it's UK English language, and it's using the English language set. Okay, moving swiftly on. Tools and structures and teams and so on. Again, this is in terms of understanding the specification. What tools are available? What is the CSTP? What is an authoring tool? What even is the language that I'm using? Is it XML? Is it SGML? Do I even know what XML and SGML are? Do I use structured language, or have I only ever used something like Word or InDesign in the past for producing documentation? And there's all these bits that you need to understand about the requirements for your authoring team. So if the authoring team have only ever worked in Word or InDesign, and they're used to just typing content straight onto a page and producing a PDF or printing it out, then suddenly the leap to a structured language using a markup language is quite a big mental concept to the change in their authoring style. I had a whole team back in my Air Force days that were used to using InDesign, and before that PageMaker. And when we then tried to move to structured language, it was a big conceptual leap, but actually once they got the hang of the concept, it took a lot of pressure off them, because they no longer had to worry about format and how things laid out on the page. All they had to worry about was the content. But it is a change of mindset. So from an authoring point of view, if we're talking about training our authors, there are certain aspects of S1000D that they will need to understand. They'll need to understand the SNS and so where their components are, and as well as the info, as well as the SNS, things like the info codes and so on. So they actually understand what data module they're trying to write, and the whole concept of writing in small module bite sizes. In fact, I just realized, let me just pop myself back down in the screen here. So yeah, when we're talking about authoring in S1000D, it's understanding that whole concept of authoring in these little modules of information, these little snippets almost. And then there are things like business rules, and you may have heard of BREX, the Business Rules Exchange. Well, the Business Rules Exchange is a file mechanism that helps us deploy our business rules. But we have to define those business rules in the first place, and the authors need to understand what the business rules are. There aren't any BREX checkers at the moment that I know of that can actually literally check on the fly as you go along. So they need to author and then check against the BREX. And obviously, if things wrong, they've got to go back and correct them. So if they have an understanding in the first place, they get it right first time, hopefully. Understanding the XML or SGML that they're writing to. And if you're not familiar with those standards, they have things called schemas or DTDs, which drive how the content is structured. And if you again, get the wrong elements because you're maybe not using an authoring tool, then when you try and deliver that piece of work, it's going to have the wrong structures in it. Simplified Technical English, that's what STE stands for. Again, depending on the project, you might be asked to write in Simplified Technical English. Technically, that is another standard outside of S1000D, but it's often called for in S1000D projects. And if your authors are being asked to write in that, they need to understand how to write in that. There are some good checking tools out that help you on the fly, but again, it still comes down to an authoring understanding of what they're trying to write. The checking tool might say, is this what you really mean? You then have to look at that piece of content and say, yeah, that is what I really mean, or actually, no, it's a good prompt, I need to reword it. Alongside the S1000D aspects, any authors, and particularly if you're taking on a new project and you're bringing new authors on board, or maybe you're using external contract authors and so on, they will still need to know any of your normal business processes. And any authoring rules or your house style, etc. And if they're using particular tools, you know, a lot of people in the industry use things like FrameMaker or Arbortext for authoring technical information. They are quite complicated tools to learn for the first time, particularly if you come from a non-structured background like Word or InDesign, and now you've got to learn a completely new product. From the business aspect, again, you need to understand what some of these principles of S1000D are because they will affect your business. How is information managed? We've gone from a system where maybe your authors wrote an entire manual as a Word document or maybe a set of Word documents and stored them in a folder to suddenly a system where we produce tens, hundreds, thousands of small, tiny, bite-sized pieces of information, any one of which could change at any time. So we've got to manage this massive information, and not only the individual pieces, but the links between them and how they interact and how they affect each other. So if I'm using, for example, an image in one data module, or better still, if I'm using an image in more than one data module and I make a change in one of them, how is that going to affect the reuse of the image in another data module? Governance. Governance is something that I go on and on and on about because having bad information is one of the worst things that you as a manufacturer or contractor can ever do. It could lead to some kind of disaster. That could be as benign as a breakdown in the equipment because there's a wrong servicing schedule. It could be as bad as some kind of crash accident, serious going wrong with the equipment because the information's been provided incorrectly. And there will be nothing worse on your business than having provided the wrong information that led to some form of accident. That's probably one of the most costly things that will ever happen, way beyond the cost of providing authors and providing editing systems and everything else. So we've got to be sure that the data that we put out is correct. And at the end of the day, it's not just the equipment, but it's potentially operators and lives that could be at stake. So we have to go through a series of governance steps. S1000D provides 2 steps of verification. These are sign-off stages that are actually stored and documented within the metadata of the data module. But how do you actually go through those steps of verification? How do you apply them? How do you document them? Are there some form of certificate that you provide? And how does that get saved? And how is that retrieved in the event of it being needed? And even down to the authors and engineers themselves, do they have to have certain qualifications to be working on the content they're working on? And again, how is that documented? How can you go back and look in history and say, well, this guy did that and he was qualified to do it and he wrote correct information? And then finally, from a decision-making point of view, is the output requirement. And again, that will potentially depend on the project that you're working with, but you need to understand what those output requirements are, because that may well affect the tools that you need to buy, the training that you need to do. So moving swiftly on. As I say, cost-wise, staff and time taken to produce the output. And if you are completely new to S1000D, obviously there's a learning curve. You've got to get people on board who understand the system. You've got to potentially put systems in place, and you've got to actually get them up to speed. Rework is costly, and we try and avoid rework because that's just a nugatory waste of time. And I've laboured the cost of mistakes, but we really want to be putting stuff out the door that's right first time every time if we can, because that's the cheapest way of doing it from an authoring team time point of view. So let's have a think about some of the tools then. From an authoring perspective, you could literally open Notepad and you could write in XML or HTML if you wanted to. It would be very hard. You would have to do an awful lot of writing of bits of tags and bits of information that aren't even anything to do with the content. So that's really not a productive way of doing it. There are very good editors out there that will support you in writing XML or HTML, if that's the case. And by doing that, they help you write good S1000D first time round. Beyond having just a tool that understands the XML schema, then you could go to the next level of S1000D specific tools that actually help you insert content. So if, for example, I want to insert a table, does it just give me the top level element for the table and then I have to physically add all the rows and the columns and the content in those? Or when I add a table, can I just tell it I want 3 rows and 6 columns and there it is for me? When I add a figure, does it automatically put the figure title in rather than me having to go and manually edit it and so on? So the more complex the tool, obviously the more training, but then generally the more that tool will do for you. And I can't recommend enough getting something that is at least S1000D aware. One odd little note aside, there is a version of S1000D in FrameMaker, which is kind of bundled free with FrameMaker. It only supports issue 4. And there are actually some big technical mistakes in the way that the schemas are presented. So if you were to ever try and use the one that comes bundled in FrameMaker, you would have to do further work before you could actually deliver that S1000D to a third party. If you're only ever going to use it internally, it's fine, it would work. But I could talk more on the technicals of various tools and stuff at length if you want at some other time. There you go. I've said most of that. Common information is an interesting one. ICNs, by the way, for those not familiar with the term, is our information control number. It used to be an illustration control number, but they recognize now that information is more than just illustrations. It might be multimedia, it might be 3D, it might be some form of augmented or virtual reality. So it's now an information control number. And then common information in the later versions of S1000D, it actually supports repositories. So I might have a repository of tools, I might have a repository of spare parts, I might have a repository of warnings, and there's various other types as well. By being able to insert those as a common information, as a link from that repository, it means if I go and update the repository item, then potentially my content is updated as well. It also means, for example, warnings is a good case. It might be that my legal team have sat and spent hours defining how a warning should be worded so that there is no ambiguity, no chance of making a mistake. If my author then mistypes the warning because he's tired and he makes an accident, suddenly we've got to change warning. Whereas if it's inserted as a link from a repository, it will always be right. It will be as it is intended by the repository owner. Another good thing about repositories as well, thinking about linking to further and external systems, is that repositories can often be updated by an external management system. And that means that you can bring in, like I say, with things like tools and spares and stuff like that, you can actually bring in bulk items and then the authors can just pick them out of the repository and use them as they need. So the dreaded CSDB. CSDB stands for a common source database. An S1000D prescribes the use of a common source database and tells you roughly what it should do, but it never, and this is true for all tools, S1000D themselves never actually recommend any specific vendor tool set. And I think that's, that's fair. They're an international standard. They're not there to promote any one company over any other. So all they do is give you an idea of what the CSDB should do. Now, if you had a simple project, it might be quite easy to just keep your files in a file system. In effect, your file system is your CSDB. You would probably want at least some kind of simple database or spreadsheet to track things like issues and updates, and maybe track external items, like certificates for verification and validation of the content and so on. But actually, a file system with all your data modules and all your ICNs in one place can work at a simple level. It gets more difficult when you then start trying to pick things out and say, right, I've got to make a delivery now. Oh, hang on, which data modules are my latest versions that I'm going to send on this delivery and so on. Small project, it works, and I've seen lots of small projects just use the Windows file system. As soon as you start getting more complex, particularly if you're a third-party vendor that is producing items that end up on multiple products, so let's say that you're an aircraft seat manufacturer, as a random example. Your seats might be on lots of different platforms, supplied to lots of different partners. You don't want to have to rewrite your data all the time because the seat ostensibly stays the same. But how do you manage variations within that content? How do you manage which set of data goes to which partner and so on? So the CSDB should help you manage all that stuff, and it should, I talk about it in terms of assets. It's your data modules and your ICNs. And any good CSDB should manage all of them for several reasons. I mean, workflow aside, workflow is simply the life cycle of a data module going from, I need to make a change, who's going to make the change, has the change been done, has the change been verified, yes, it's all been done, now it's signed off and now it's released. But also things like links between your content, so links between one data module and another, links between these repositories and your data modules, links between your data modules and your ICNs. So if I'm updating an ICN, how many data modules is that going to affect? And do I need to up issue those as well because the ICN content has now changed? And so we come back to governance. A good CSDB will track all your changes for you. It will, in your change history, it will show you who did them, when they were done, possibly why they were done. There should be some kind of support for attachments from external sources. So, for example, the initial work requirement, why was this change actually triggered? And then the verification elements, was there a sign-off certificate? Who signed it off? Who said it was okay to actually release this information? So the CSDB does all that. And as I say, the CSDB should track your change as well. One of the key things that I've got a little bit of a crusade about, because I think S1000D have got it slightly wrong, is when you have these repository items, and there's other levels as well. There's something called a publication module, for example, which drives the data modules that go into a publication. S1000D allows us to create links between these things implicitly. So it just uses the data module code without any additional information to say which issue we were at or which language version we were at. That's great because it means that when I update my content, my publication module still has relevant links. The problem is, if I've issued my publication at issue 1, I've then gone away and changed all the data modules. I've maybe changed some of the repositories that link into those data modules. I've maybe changed some of the graphics that link in. If all I've done is used implicit links throughout, that publication module is still at issue 1, and I could reissue the book with a completely different set of content, still ostensibly issue 1. So one of the things we're trying to do with our CSDB is make sure that things like those issue links and links between repositories and data modules and so on have additional tracking on them. So you can get around that problem entirely by always making your links explicit, i.e. you always include an issue number, you always include a language code and so on. But if you don't want to write that way, or if you've received a whole lot of data that's not written that way, then you need some other way of tracking your change and supporting your governance. Anyway, crusade over. Let's move swiftly on. I've only got a few more to go now. Probably going to run over a little bit. I hope it's okay for everyone, and then we can still run into that question time at the end. Graphics. Graphics generally are handled outside of S1000D, certainly in terms of the creation of them. normally you would just get the graphic tool for the type of graphic that you want to use. S1000D in general prefers vector graphics. So CGM is the current flavor of the standard. SVG is coming. There's a new change request in to get SVG recognized by the standard. And I know a lot of people are using SVGs already. So as long as your tools support them, you should be okay in that. Again, if you're going to do things like hotspots and so on, you want your tools to be able to support that hotspotting, not only in production, the graphic, but also in your editing tool so that you can actually make use of the hotspots and link your data and your content to those hotspots in your graphics. And I say there that ICNs should be managed in the same way as DMs. They should. The one big difference, obviously, is your data modules are in XML already, and therefore they can contain metadata, which tells you about their issue number and when they were issued and all the other bits and pieces. ICNs, generally graphic formats, don't contain metadata. So you've either got to try and manage that in your file system and maybe in your spreadsheets, or hopefully if you're in a CSDB, you can manage some of that in your CSDB. And then publishing, and one of the good things about S1000D is the fact that it's in XML. Means that you can publish it however you need it to. So you could just send away data modules. You could use that to print books if you use an appropriate style sheet, and you can use it to generate interactive electronic technical publications, IETPs. And S1000D really was designed for electronic consumption, which is why it's in these little bite-sized chunks, and you can jump from one chunk to the next chunk to the next chunk as you do your various procedures and so on. But there are times, particularly at the operator side, where you still want a book, even if that's maybe an electronic book, like a PDF page turner. And so it might be that you need some tool to get from all these individual data modules actually into some form of print book. And then with other tools as well, some of these may well be built into a CSDB or into an authoring tool. Often things like schema validation is almost done automatically by your authoring tool anyway. And aside from those, conversion of data. So if I've got a logistic support system that might be in one of the other S series standards like S2000M or S3000L, or it might be in an international standard like GEIA standard 0007, those data formats have already been defined out on the World Wide Web. So if we want to use them in our S1000D, we need maybe some way of actually pulling that data out and converting it and making it usable in the S1000D. And what we want to avoid doing is having to rework. The more that we can just convert and consume existing data, the less that we've actually got to do, and the less mistakes potentially that we make because we're just reusing existing data. My bottom line on tool sets for everyone I speak to is that the very first thing you do when you're defining your tool requirements is you define what your project needs in terms of its inputs, its outputs, and its processes. And only once you understand what your project needs, do you then find your tool sets. And I see it so many times that people engage with, very reputable vendors who have got amazing tool sets that do S1000D, and so they buy in. And actually, they only needed 10% of what that incredible toolset offers. So in effect, they've bought 90% of waste. On the flip side, you don't want to go in with a great big project that needs all sorts of complexity because you're delivering to multiple customers with multiple data sources and so on and so on and so on. And you bought the cheapest toolset you could find, and it doesn't actually do half of what you need. And so the remaining half of your process ends up being a real manual drain on your resources. So define first, understand inputs, outputs, and processes, then find a tool set that actually meets those. Okay, project setup. If you are working on your own, that's one thing. If you're working for someone else, then they will probably already have a lot of requirements. So if you're producing data because you're subcontracting into a prime, they will dictate probably the version of S1000D you've got to use, probably language versions, whether you're using simplified technical English or not. They will probably specify a lot of the codification and stuff as well. You'll often find that the top level or the prime will define the top layers of codification. And let's say that you're an engine manufacturer, they're going to say, right, well, we know that engines are topic 71 or topic 72. Then you can define your own codes below that, but you're going to be part of topic 72. So you might get to create the lower breakdown. One thing I found when you're doing SNS creation, and I use this to do our own publications, is mind mapping. So I'm not kind of trying to show you the detail that's on screen, but just to give you an idea of how I work through this. So somewhere there, you can see there's my U for user guide, and over here I've got a V for installation guide and so on. This U is the one that you saw in my code breakdown earlier. And then my first level of breakdown is this column here. So you can see right at the top there, we've got the introduction at 00 and then describe the interface. I can't put my hand too high because I run out of camera, but so we describe the interface. And then within each of those sections is the next level of hierarchical breakdown and so on. And S1000D gives us these 3 levels of hierarchical breakdown to understand our topics and our systems. So that's how mind mapping can help. It could be that depending what you're providing, and engines is possibly a good example, because if you're a company like Rolls-Royce, then you probably document your engines entirely from the top down anyway. So you probably already have your own model ident codes. But S1000D allows model ident codes to be used within other projects. So, the aeroplane that's consuming those engines will have its own model ident code and its own set of S1000D structures. But you can go along and provide your codification system as a complete self-contained package. That obviously comes from the discussions at contract time between you and the prime of exactly what they want. And it will normally be told to you. It's not normally something that you would turn around and get to argue the case. And then information generation. So this is the information code part. That is you understanding your own systems and being able to say, okay, I'm producing this component. This component needs an install process, a uninstall process, a repair process, maybe a test process. So therefore, I've got to write those 4 data types. And so you generate your information codes based on your product breakdown. Again, business rules, I mentioned these a bit earlier. They may well come from your prime if you're working for a prime. Business rules do allow you to have a layered approach. So it might be that you have your own house rules for your content, certain things that will be written or presented in certain ways. And so you can have your own layer of breaks. Doesn't mean that you're allowed to break your prime's business rules because they've already written those, they apply as well. But it acts in effect like a pyramid system. And the business rules help us in terms of our content, our presentation. There's all sorts of rules. And people get hung up on the Brex file itself. The business rules do not come from the Brex file. The business rules come from doing an analysis within S1000D. And there's a lot of tools there to help you. And they list in a big spreadsheet all the business rule decision points that you need to make. And then from that, you create your Brex file, which helps apply those business rules to your content at an electronic level. And then finally comes an understanding of actually what you've been asked to supply. So if you've been asked to supply systems and procedures and content, and how that's going to be produced, what you don't want to be doing is creating a massive great team that's only going to supply a few descriptive data modules, or vice versa, end up with a tiny team that cannot produce the amount of required work because you've got to supply all the engineering procedures and all the descriptive systems and everything else. Don't underestimate the complexity of S1000D. You can end up with many, many thousands of data modules, even for a fairly simple product, because you have this multiplication factor of the information code. So whereas in the old days, we may have written one manual about, go back to my aircraft seat example, now we might have hundreds of data modules that deal with all the different individual aspects of that seat. But on the flip side, don't make it more difficult than it has to be, because if you don't need to write a separate install and remove procedure, because you can use, there is a code for a combined replace procedure, which in effect is an install and a remove, then just write that one data module rather than writing two separate ones, and things like that. So again, it comes back to understanding your content. The more you get into your content, the more you can define your project codification and your information codes. Okay, I've gone over a little bit, but just these last few points quickly. So there's no way I can cover existing data to any great extent now in terms of how would I convert my existing data. It absolutely depends what format your existing data is already in. Is it already in a structured language? Is it in something like Word or InDesign? It also depends on how consistent your original data is. Is your original data in great big single volume manuals, in which case you're going to have to break it down into data modules. So how do you generate and design those breakpoints? The biggest thing is that you've got to do that piece of analysis. It might be that the quickest way of doing it is to actually rekey the content, work out where those breakpoints are, and just start again with your new data module and new structures. But it might be that there is some form of electronic conversion you can do. And I'd say this hand on heart, every electronic conversion that I've seen has involved a degree of manual intervention, and that might be more or less, but there is no kind of magic bullet that will turn Word or anything else into S1000D. I said that at the bottom, one of the easiest things to convert is images, because images generally, other than renaming them, are going to work straight away in your content. And the final point is deliverables. And again, this is going to be down to the customer, what the customer has required. But again, don't make it more complicated than it has to be. If the customer has said, I just want data modules, then don't offer them a PDF, and don't offer them an ITP, and don't offer them a paper manual. Just deliver the XML or the SGML. If you're delivering data modules, you should deliver them with what's known as a DDN, a data dispatch note. But again, some people aren't even worried about that. And creating and managing a DDN might be a function of your CSDB, it might not. But if it's not, and you've got to do it manually, then it's a complicated process. You've got to list all the data modules that are going to be in a delivery. If they haven't asked for it, don't waste time doing it, as long as what you are delivering is accurate and concise and consistent. Apart from that, the various other forms of PDF, paper manuals and so on, I've talked a bit about already, but there's no quick and simple way of going, I've got data modules, I want to print a PDF manual. You need some form of external application that's going to help you convert those. So as I say, this really is that kind of initial set of priming questions to make you start thinking about, okay, we've been asked to do S1000D, where are we going with this? There is an awful lot more. If you are producing something for multiple customers or multiple variants, then there is applicability, and understanding how applicability works and setting it up in the first place. There are specialist data modules that help you design and define your applicability. Connection with external systems. If those connections are available and they help you import content and help you maintain content, then that's great, because that's less work at the authoring interface. And different formats for delivery. So we have a lot of customers now that are creating content in S1000D, so they get the benefits of the modularized system and the management of those modules, but they are still producing external, if you like, to S1000D publications. So the ATA CMP is quite an obvious one, because that's specifically designed around doing ATA style publications from S1000D content, and they have specific business rules. But we're also doing stuff now, for example, with, in the UK, what's known as an Army Equipment Support publication. It's an old format publication. It was designed entirely as a paper specification, but we've now got people producing it directly from S1000D, because at the end of the day, it's faster and quicker and more cost effective to maintain S1000D, and then just use a style sheet and generate AESPs. So that was a bit of a whistle stop tour I'm happy to open up the floor and take questions. You'll probably need to unmute yourself if you're going to ask a question. I think you should be able to unmute yourselves. Jamie, I can see you've got a hand up, but you got a question?
Can you hear me, Steve?
I can now, yes.
Hey,
Who was
well,
it?
that wasn't me. I think that was somebody else. So concerning the data module code.
Yeah.
Does every bit of that get placed in a data module for each and every data module, or is some of that not necessarily needed? I shouldn't say needed, but not included.
Yeah, all of that. What I'll do is I'll find the slide and just bring it back up if I can. Oh, going the wrong way. Where's it gone? So there it is. So other than the DMC on the front and the .xml on the end, which makes it a file name, then all of the rest of that code is actually part of the XML identification of a data module. A data module actually contains two main chunks. There's what's known as the ID and status at the beginning, which gives you all the codification about it, when it was produced, etc., etc. And then there's the content section. And there are various different data module types that can contain different types of content. So you have some that look after procedures, some that are there that are purely descriptive, others that do functions like our applicability tables and so on. But within the ID and status of all of them will be, in effect, the content from this data module code. Really, the file name comes from the data module content, not the other way around. The content doesn't come from the file name. Does that answer that one?
Yes, it does, and it looks. Maybe I read more into it than what I thought, and then just the last question before I close out, the Mekon pubs that you've got in front, that would be replaced with either an aircraft or a ship or a tank or whatever.
Yeah, that Mekon pubs bit is the project, basically, is whatever the actual product is. And then the N02 are variants of that product. So, for example, in the UK here, we have the Typhoon aircraft. There are various different versions of the Typhoon. So the top level here would be something along the lines of Typhoon. And then the next level down, the N02 would have different codes, for example, for different export versions or different models, different batches and so on.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any more?
Yeah, I have one question for you. If, let's say you do a new project and it's to version like 4.1,
yeah,
that has like the repositories you mentioned and so forth. And then later you have another customer project come in which uses a large portion of what you've already done, but they're specifying like version 3.
Yeah.
What level of gymnastics is involved in doing that?
That's quite a difficult one. So generally within a dotted version, so 4.0, 4.1, 4.2, pretty much the element names, the attribute provision was consistent. So yeah, from 4.1, from 4.0, obviously a few things got added, and 4.2, a few extra things got added. But the naming was consistent. Between the major versions like the 3 dots and the 4 dots and the 5 dots, then there are potentially bigger jumps. 4 to 5 isn't too bad, because when we got to issue 4, everything went to XML schema only. And so at that point, they could pretty much settle on what the names were. Prior to 4.0, we were in mix of SGML and XML. And obviously prior to version 2, we were SGML only. And so the names then were driven more by the limited requirements of SGML. And so there's a big leap, 4 back to free would be hard work. You can obviously rename all the tags. That can be done, fairly mechanically. And then you need to look at the structures. And this is why I was saying with data conversion earlier, it's really quite difficult, even if you already come from a structured language. And I've done conversions where they've taken projects from 1.8 SGML up to 4.1 in XML. Renaming the tags was pretty easy. And then you had to start looking at things like, how have my structures changed? Have I got to move elements around? One of the key ones, for example, was figures and tables used to be in paragraphs. They came outside of paragraphs. Then you've got to think, well, hang on, have I got applicability on that paragraph? Because if I take the figure and table out, that figure and table now need to have their own applicability applied, and so on and so on. So you've almost got to look at it on a case-by-case basis and say, what am I changing? What is my original content? Because if, for example, you're changing just descriptive, that's not too bad. If you're changing procedural, it gets a little bit more complicated. If you're changing a lot of true stuff, it probably gets even harder again. So, you've got to take it on a case-by-case basis. What is the content? Where am I going from and to? And what kind of transform am I going to have to enact to do that?
If you're brand new to this, is it best then to start with the most current version, or would it be best to start with like 4?
If you are doing this just because you think, let's get into S1000D, I would probably start with the most current, because then you get the most facilities. I certainly wouldn't start, if I was starting from scratch, anything earlier than probably 4.1 or 4.2, because at that point you've got most of the current facilities. Obviously 5.0 has added a few things, but that's more in kind of data module types than actual structures within an individual data module. I certainly wouldn't start at 3 or 2, because there's just so much missing. And if I need to convert later to a more modern version, that's going to be a huge leap.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any more?
Yeah,
just a quick one from me.
Oh,
Can
sorry.
you hear me okay first?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Cool.
Robert. Yep. Hiya.
All right. You mentioned people are producing AESPs with S1000D. Do you know if that's because they've been asked to, or if they're just doing it off their own back kind of thing?
I've actually now been involved with a couple of projects doing that. So the first one that came along to us, they already had their content in S1000D, and then they were contracting in addition to the UK MOD, and therefore had been asked for ASPs. And so they needed a way to get that content out to an ASP. The second project that I've kind of been talking with that need to do ASPs already use the UK MOD, but are looking at going to S1000D to get the benefits of S1000D.
Okay, thank you.
And who was the other one? Was it Scott, was it?
It was, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
So getting back to the previous gentleman's question regarding just tinkering around with the software, does the Mecon software afford you that ability to be able to set up a demonstration type environment to kind of play with, or would that kind of throw things off?
How do you mean? As in, could we provide you a demo of our software, as in like a trial version?
No. I'm talking about we actually have the software,
right,
going in and setting up that environment for the 3.1 to 4.0 or whatever, and just playing around with it.
So there isn't a built-in conversion capability within the Mecon tools. The way the tools are designed is, if you are working on 4.1, then you will get the 4.1 schemas and everything will be validated at 4.1. If you open a 3.0 document, then it will open as 3.0. The CSDB, for example, actually is completely agnostic to the version that you put into it. So you can have a project where you have different versions of data modules sat side by side each other, because each time you open one, then the tool looks at the heading information, says, well, this is 3.0, I will treat it as 3.0. Conversion work, really, you need to take kind of offline in terms of looking at it and saying, I've got this, 4.1 XML, I now need to do some 3.0 data, or vice versa. there's very few conversions that go backwards. Most conversions go forwards. Going forwards is definitely easier because, in effect, you're taking everything that you've got at the earlier version, and then by moving forward, there is additional capability in the newer version that you're not actually losing, you're gaining. If you try and go backwards, then, for example, if you've used all the common repositories in version 4 and you try and go backwards to version 3 or even version 2, you lose those common repositories. And so you've then not only got to change all your tags and your existing content, but you've then got to make up for all those missing links. So you've then got to write some kind of external structure that can go and delve into the common repository, pull out the linked item and actually insert it as basic content rather than as a link. So there's a whole world of things that you need to look at in terms of converting data. It's really not simple, even within S1000D. And obviously, if you come from outside S1000D, it's a whole different world again.
Yep. Okay, good response. Thank you.
Okay, any more for any more? Stunned silence. Brilliant. Well, I hope it's been used to you. I will just flick through to my very last slide because then you get nice Mekon back on the screen. The one thing I will mention, if you haven't seen it already, or if you not have one of the mail shots, we do an S1000D 101 guide. So whereas today was more about what you need to consider from a business perspective getting into S1000D, the 101 guide does go things like how data modules work, what data module types there are, how the data module code works, what some of the acronyms are. So if you want that little 101 primer, ping me a quick email afterwards and I can send you out a link for that and you can download those. Or if you forget after this, hit our website, aerospace-defense.com. And on our website, again, there's a sign up page where you can download the 101 page. Download the 101 ebook. All right. So thank you very much for your time and attention this afternoon. I will send out a link to everybody with the meeting recording once that's been uploaded. And thank you all for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Cheers. Bye all.
Have a good day. Bye.
Bye.